My name's Jacob Haler. I'm the Executive Director at ESA. We're the trade body which represents the UK's waste and recycling industry. What I'll try and do in my 2 minutes is give a little bit of context in terms of what we do and why, and what the direct impacts might be for Brexit on our trade in waste. So what do we do with the EU? Well, we export a lot of material both for recycling but also for treatment in energy recovery plants. There's between 3 and 4 million tonnes of recycled materials that goes to the EU. A lot of that, probably 2.5 million tonnes, is scrap metal, and that's worth about £1 billion a year, almost £1 billion a year. We also send over 4 million tonnes of waste as a fuel, which is used to generate power in places like the Netherlands, Germany, and bits of Scandinavia. And we actually pay them to take that material, treat it on our behalf. Why do we do that? Because we don't have the facilities to deal with this material at home. We don't have energy recovery plants, sufficient energy recovery plants here in the UK to treat that stuff, and we don't have the domestic capacity to process the recycle it back into products here in the UK. So the impacts could be in terms of a hard Brexit might mean some tariffs in the case of fuel. Tariffs on metals, thankfully, under WTO are zero, so less of an impact there, but there could be non-tariff barriers, administration costs, all adding up to higher costs, more delays, potentially less material going abroad and therefore being landfilled here at home.
My name is Steve Lee. I'm an independent consultant, today representing the interests of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, for whom I was the Chief Executive up until this time last year. You're going to hear through the rest of this evidence session that export is very important to the waste and resource sector in the UK. Jacob's already given you some figures. Reliance on export of materials, particularly plastics, metals, textiles, because the UK has got a good track record in collecting and reprocessing these materials, but we only have a certain demand for those materials in industry in the UK, so we're heavily reliant on export. We're also reliant on export of part processed material not suitable for recycling as a fuel, particularly across the North Sea to other European member states. You're going to hear that the impact of Brexit on that trade is far from clear. We've no clear ideas whether or not we're going to be access to the single market, part of the EEA or the Customs Union. Could open up policy differences between the UK and other EU member states. Could bring border issues, particularly for Ireland, possibly for Gibraltar. There could be tariffs, there could be non-tariff barriers to trade, such as product standards. If the detailed composition of plastics in the UK, because products have changed, different to the EU, it could mean that we have difficulty placing those plastics into a market that isn't ready for them. We'll be looking for three things for the future, because there's no doubt pressure will be on this industry to recycle more, to send less to landfill, to reduce waste in all sorts of ways, but there's no point in just pressing this industry to do that without making sure that the markets are there ready to take the materials that we place back into the market. We'll be looking for protection and support of business with the EU, policy continuity, simplified trade controls, protect and develop non-UK markets, and that will centre particularly for me around the quality of what we place back into the market and stimulating UK demand for what we prepare. And we have an opportunity to do that through the UK industrial strategy, a resource strategy. It's something that we want to stimulate.
My name is Ray Georgeson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Resource Association. We appreciate the interest and the spotlight that you are placing on our industries. It seems often that we're only in the spotlight when there are issues and challenges for our industries, and for me that's a shame sometimes, because we are the unsung heroes of British industry, collecting, recycling, reprocessing into products, recovering energy and safely disposing of the nation's wastes and resources 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My own part of the sector, which is primarily the reprocessors, those companies that make goods from recycled materials, and their supply chain deal with approximately 7 million tonnes a year of UK materials. We employ 12,500 people directly, and we contribute 3.3 billion to UK GDP. There are concerns around Brexit. They mirror those that have been signalled by other larger voices in industry, such as CBI and the EEF. They concentrate on the concern they have about the protracted nature of the negotiations, and the uncertainty that that generates in industry in terms of future investment. Serious concerns about the loss of benefits related to the single market and the customs union. Some concerns about the danger of economic downturn and basically finished goods and products we will be buying less of potentially, whether they be cars or cardboard boxes. That clearly has an impact. We are also concerned about labour mobility and particularly about a degree of dependency that parts of our industry have on non-UK EU nationals for the sorting and collecting and processing of materials across the whole of our sector. What we need is clarity, we need ambition, and we need a long-term policy direction from our government. Brexit is the wrong trigger for this.
In terms of the future relationship, and I'm going to assume for the moment, although we don't have to, as we've been reminded, that we're probably not going to be in the single market or the customs union, because that is what the government's current policy is, then what is the key factor is that going to really get in the way of trade as it is at the minute or not? We had a definition between the trade for effectively waste for energy and also the recycling, but we also have we've had another category, if you like, which is hazardous waste, which is even more difficult. And if anybody's got anything to say, particularly on that, where the OECD conventions are even stronger and some current EU law, I would also be interested. So what are the key, are there things that is this going to be the least affected area, as was suggested, or are there real dangers here? Does anybody want to come in on that just to emphasise those points? Then I'll open it out to the committee. Yes, please, then. Yeah, thank you, Unica. Yeah.
Well, I made coming here, I made an assessment of the trade barriers, especially the tariffs, and what is going to happen is that the tariffs are going to be, the World Trade Organization tariffs are going to be in place. That means 6.5% additional costs have to be borne, and if you compare that with other countries outside the EU, which do not have this 6.5%, but even go to 0%, I'm a little bit worried about it actually, because we have to understand that the United Kingdom has gone a long way to depart from large-scale landfilling. You did a very good job to make good use of the resources inside of waste. But if we get into a situation of a cliff edge scenario, then about 3.5 million tons of waste most probably has to be landfilled again in the UK, and that will cost you additionally 5 million tons of CO2. But also traders could maybe use the opportunity to go for outlets outside the European area, where there are trade tariffs of 0%. And that is not always good for environment, especially not when in these countries there is not sufficient infrastructure for treatment.
Okay, so you think there might be a diversion of trade, yes, potentially. Could I just ask you, just about non-tariff barriers? How do you see those, or briefly? Are they more of a problem?
I think less of a problem, because the OECD rulings are in place, all the administrative issues are in place. I think that will be less of a problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
Yes. Steve Lee. A specific type of non-tariff barrier that I would raise to you, and that is, as product policy starts to diverge between the UK and EU member states, it's quite possible that EU standards for, I don't know, polypropylene in consumer goods or in vehicles will be different from those in the EU. For example, different flame retardants. That might mean that UK polypropylene would no longer be welcome in EU markets. It's something that we have to bear in mind. Dustin brought up the importance of product policy in the future. It's not something that I would expect to bite particularly deeply on day one, but I do expect product policy to be divergent, and that will be increasingly important.
I think the definition of what counts as waste and when it stops becoming waste and starts becoming a secondary raw material is really critical here. We did some work with the Dutch government and the UK government on something called the North Sea Resources Roundabout, which was essentially an attempt to harmonise different regulators' views about when something stopped being waste in order to be able to promote reuse and recycling of materials. That took place within the context of both countries being member states of the EU and a common and shared regulatory framework. If we decide to stay out of that regulatory framework, if we decide to diverge, those sorts of opportunities to increase trade on the basis of mutual standards could be undermined.
Okay, thank you. Ray. Ray George.
Following Dustin, actually, because I chaired a number of the meetings of the North Sea Resources Roundabout, partly for the Dutch government and for the Green Alliance, and I would echo what Dustin has just said. I think picking up on a point that Jacob made in his opening presentation, and Steve's touched on it in relation to the non-tariff barriers, I think the potential for sluggishness perhaps in the continuing trade in waste is quite strong in territory where frankly the profit margin is pretty tight, I'm sure, on per tonne movement of waste from one country to the next. And so anything that gets in the way in terms of the new bureaucracy that will emerge outside of the customs union could certainly have a sluggish effect on trade. But I think, as other colleagues have said, we're projecting something that nobody is really sure about the outcomes of yet. But I think it would be reasonable to assume that there will be sluggishness if margins are made even more tight than they already are.
Yes, this is a sheet from the Professor Joseph Fixer from the State University in Ohio, where he shows the raw material interdependence of the UK to be prosperous. And as you know, waste is the end of the production and consumption phase. And we actually want to move on towards a circular economy. And therefore we need also scale. And at the moment the Dutch and the UK are in the North Sea Resource Roundabout working very closely together, but also on knowledge, sharing information and experience. We have very sophisticated supply lines at the moment. And you can imagine, looking only at this picture, that making all kinds of new trade agreements within 1.5 years to make sure that your prosperity stays at the same level is maybe a mission impossible.